Pat's husband, Stan, abused Pat throughout their 50-year marriage. Pat and Stan lived their later years in California in a home owned by their son, Rick. In this video, you will hear from Pat, Rick, his wife, Paula, Pat's sister, and niece.
Well, first of all, started out, he was very, very controlling. I mean, he didn't want me to go here or there without him, and he didn't approve of, you know, going out with my friends or anything like that. And for the first while, I would say 4 or 5 months, he was very pleasant, but then he started getting real ugly. I mean, he just called me the awfulest names that you can think of, you know.
I always heard my mom referred to as the F word and the C word were used in combination a lot, and I knew those words, you know, from as far back as I can remember.
If he get into these terrible angers, he would keep Rick home from school, and he would close all the doors and windows. Nobody was allowed to come in. There was no TV or radios on, and it was just a terrible atmosphere.
But then there would be the time when I would be walking home from school, and it would, you know, we're talking on a weekly basis. And I'd be walking with my friends, and I'd hear from a block away, I would hear this cursing and this foul language being screamed at the top of a person's lungs. And we'd get closer to my house, and my friends would say, "Hey, is that coming from your house?" And I'd say, "Hey, man, why don't you guys just go away, leave me alone." And I'd sit on the curb and I didn't want to go to the house. I mean, I just sit there and go, I can't stand this abuse. And then I'd get in the house, and it would continue sometimes as long as 20 hours. Would go straight.
And that he'd keep me up to 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and yelling and screaming and doing all, you know, making a fool of himself, really. And then he'd go to bed and sleep all day, and I'd go to work.
You know, my aunt was the main one that was the provider and the one that went to work. Often my uncle didn't work because his anger would take over and he'd lose a job. You know, every situation was always somebody else's fault. It was never him. So there wasn't a lot of surplus money or resources for her to get past the day-to-day struggle. I think she was in denial a lot of times, or she couldn't have lived her life.
And I mean, I got so used to it, I could, you know, I wasn't even hearing him half the time.
She had a hard time just functioning. So then you just start having the abuse pile up.
I think you just become numb with it all. I don't think you can think straight when you're in a situation like that myself.
And your self-esteem gets so battered, you know, where you begin to feel like you're not capable of making good choices, you're not capable of doing different circumstances, of trusting other people when people are supposed to love you or treating you badly. My aunt was isolated a lot with him. You know, she wasn't allowed to have telephone conversations or some of the things you take for granted. He controlled her in lots of ways.
When we were at their house, which was rarely, if I would try to talk to her, just the two of us, and we were usually all 4 in the same room, she had to make sure that she could hear every single word this guy was saying, because he would just all of a sudden yell, "Isn't that right, Pat?" And she had to have an answer right then and there, listening to everything he said, even though we were talking. And if she didn't have an answer, he would just be livid with her.
I was so scared myself as a child that it did, and I can explain one of the incidents that caused this fear. I was sitting at a table, much as we are right now, and I was, again, that same small young boy, and I was eating my dinner, and my mom was walking past the table, and he reached over and he took the fork off of my plate that I was eating my food with, and as she walked behind him, he swung around and he buried that fork in her thigh. And as you can imagine, the pain and the fear that took place in my mom, she immediately fell to the ground, and he jumped on top of her and just was, with both fists, he was punching her in the face and the chest. And I thought as a young boy, and as a child, I was so scared that I thought I was going to witness a murder take place right there. And that, when you instill that kind of fear in a small child or anybody, in any kind of but a human being, I mean, it sticks with you, and you remember that, and you know that you're next if you intervene. That was the time I was talking about where the police took us aside and they asked what was going on and that, and we were so scared that, you know, we didn't say anything although he had been hitting her, you know, we didn't admit to that fact because they probably would have taken him away on that night, but because she never said anything and I never said anything, they didn't do it.
It was hard to cover up bruises, you know, and I'd have all kinds of excuses, you know. I bumped myself, or I hit something, or something fell on me at work, or something like that.
I remember when I was a kid, when, you know, there's a few times was questioned if she had a black eye or a fat lip or something, you know, bruises on her arms. So what he would do, and I've seen him purposely do this in the kitchen of our house, take her in the kitchen and punch her in the upper back shoulders so that the bruises would be underneath her clothing so that when she went to work it wouldn't be questioned. And I heard him tell her that's why he was doing that.
My uncle was a smart person, and he could have a personality change, and he could act very charming. He would know how to be interviewed and come across as being very nice.
Mm-hmm. And he could be very nice around the people he wanted to be nice to.
He could be very charming if he wanted to.
Like
so.
I have a son-in-law who wouldn't believe that he was like that. And for 10 years he never saw him in a temper because he knew how to control it around himself. So it's very hard to pin something on them when they're being Mr. Nice to certain types of people.
You know, your main source of where you're supposed to feel safe is at your house. And when you don't feel safe, and you don't have anybody else that will really believe it's as bad as it is. Because for her to say how bad it was, she'd have to own up how bad it really was. And that's a hard thing.
And, you know, a lot of times I thought my mom ought to get us out of here. But then when I think back, she did. On at least 3 or 4 occasions, she took us out of there. And he always followed us. He always got us back. And any time you involved the authorities, it was like, you know, what are you doing to cause this problem? It's not a matter of we're here to intervene or we're here to help you and make you safe. They just didn't do that then.
It always seemed it was the woman's fault. You know, they always seemed to say, and so I figured, well, what's the sense of me trying to get help, because it always seems that you know, you were more or less blamed. What are you doing wrong? You know, I had one counselor ask me, well, what are you doing wrong?
I think there was a whole thing of you made your bed, you lay in it, you know. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that you were able to go ask for help without feeling like you're the failure.
Well, it was, you know, I had suppressed it so long, even though I was a police officer and I dealt with domestic violence all the time. I looked at things. You don't want your own little dirty secrets out, so I suppressed it, and I was still doing that. Even as an adult, I was keeping this stuff in, and I was just hoping that my mom was not being abused, which I shouldn't have just hoped that, because it was happening and it was ongoing all the time. But I was away from it, so I guess it was an insulation for myself.
Over the years, it didn't get any better, and the language got worse.
The intervention should have been much, much sooner by everybody, by the authorities, by myself, and everything else. And she had several health problems. In fact, she walked on a walker because he hit her in the knees with a police billy club and caused damage to her knees, so she still walks on a walker because of that. So she comes back, and I make a doctor's appointment for her, and she goes to the doctor, and they check her in the hospital to do some tests, and she has a heart attack, and her heart stops.
And I quit breathing twice on the table. And then they used the paddles on me, and then they had a man on the table that they were going to do surgery, heart surgery.
So they removed somebody from the operating table, took her in immediately. They did bypass surgery, 3 bypasses, I believe, and replaced a valve in her heart. Then he fixed it after that with the HIPAA laws so that no one could see my mom in the hospital. So for weeks, we had no idea whether she was going to live or die. She was in a coma for 7 days, and we could have no contact with her whatsoever. My aunts, myself, my wife, nobody. So nobody could visit her except him. And here, I mean, that's like, you know, here's you're like leading the criminal to the cache, and just letting them have at it how they wanted. And he did. He went to the hospital. He created a ruckus in the hospital. And the nurses came in because he was throwing furniture around in the room. They had to ask him to leave. So finally, they served him with the restraining order. He got the eviction notice. But what was unfortunate, she was getting ready to move out of the hospital. And there was a social worker who worked for the hospital. And she told him, in fact, I have a note here where he wrote it down with his little scribbling, that she was going to Arbor Hills medical facility, and that's where she was going to be. And she was not at all supposed to tell anybody. There was a restraining order, and she was not supposed to say where she was going. And so he knew now where she was going. So my mom says, "Well, he knows now. I want you to send me somewhere else." And the social worker told her that you don't know what you're talking about. You were brought here from the convalescent hospital. You're going back. My mom says, "No, I wasn't. I came from my home to the hospital. I know exactly what was going on." And she says, "Well, you don't know what you're talking about. You're going here." And they sent her there. And well, I followed the ambulance down there, and sure enough, he's sitting in the parking lot waiting. In fact, he gets out of the van, and they're taking him on a tour of the facility because they had no idea that what was going on. I went in the back door, and I gave them a copy of the restraining order because I didn't want to have a confrontation with him. So they went and gave him a copy, told him he had to leave.
My uncle took a loaded gun and drove over here with the van. So I called where my mom was visiting my aunt in the rest home where my aunt was recovering from surgery.
Because of his violent behavior and the fact that he had the gun and was running around, they feared for my mom in the convalescent hospital because he'd made several threats about killing her and killing himself. So they put armed police officers in the parking lot 24 hours a day.
I didn't know what he would do at that point. Mm-hmm. He wasn't rational at that point. He already felt he'd lost everything. Mm-hmm. He didn't feel he had any options left. I was very frightened.
2 days later, they found his body about a quarter mile away under a bush where he had crawled up under this bush by a church and shot himself in the head. You know, I hate to say it, but it was a big relief to everybody. It was like, finally, it's over with, you know. We don't have to put up with this anymore. I think my mother is finally, she's sometimes like a teenage girl. She's like she's been reborn again. And she still drives. She got her driver's license back. And one of the things he did, he took her driver's license away from her. And she got her driver's license back. She has her own little apartment. She's got her own little business, and she's quite happy, even though she walks around on a walker. I mean, it doesn't hold her back. She goes everywhere she wants.
And so I go home, and like last night, I sat down and I drank that fuzzy navel, watched the ball game, and I woke up at 10 minutes to 2 in my chair, and I hadn't even had my supper.
But I would say Pat would be now just like she's been let out of prison.
She's free as a bird.
She can do the things she wants.
She's happy.
Yeah.
To me, it's a rewarding experience to see, and I want her to experience as many things as she can, because she's 83 now, so I tell her every day, whatever you want to do, go for it. Have a good time.
No, it's just, I can't believe it. I can't believe that I'm free.